Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so we'll get started in 1 minute.
All right.
So, good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the second day of Europe in Discourse. Yesterday we talked about values and borders, and today we start, and we're very happy for that. We start with Soti Triantafyllou, giving the third keynote for the conference. Soti is a historian with a background in French literature and a PhD on American history and civilization. She's a novelist, an essayist, visiting professor, teacher, and she will be talking about the inevitability of a divided world, autocracy, democracy, gray zones, and the global coalition of democracies. So thank you very much, Soti, for being here with us today.
Good morning. We're so few, it's too early for things like that. It's really early, and here it's 8 o'clock. So are we going to start immediately or wait a few minutes? I don't know. What do you want me to do?
We can pretty much start. There are people coming in, as you know, probably in the next 1 or 2 minutes. But we pretty much have some other people over in Zoom because it's an online presentation anyway. So I suggest that we get started. Thank you.
Well, I've kind of written everything down because I have this. I'm prone to speechifying, and as I said, it's too early in the morning to go on and on about geopolitics. Here are some thoughts on, as you said, on the inevitability of a divided world and about geopolitics today. I'm speaking out of a very small corner of the world. So my take on major geopolitical questions is totally insignificant. However, here they are. Here are the questions. Would self-efficiency inside a circle of allies be beneficial for Europe and the West? Is it possible to minimize our interaction and friction with rogue states, with adversaries, and all the frenemies that surround the West? Is there a new Cold War going on? And how is this relevant? I mean, if we give the ongoing mess a name, does it even mean something? And how can we preserve peace when nuclear threats are uttered with so much brio? Above all, what have we done so wrong in the West? Shouldn't we admit some responsibility, and why don't we? Thing is that our enormous needs for energy and for stuff, for lots of stuff, have made us dependent on autocratic regimes, and vice versa, of course. Autocracies are dependent on us as customers, yet customers can be found elsewhere. It's a wide world. Anyway, this asymmetrical codependency can be a peacemaker, but it's also problematic because it comes with hubris and blindness that we have been calling realpolitik for too long. German words sound very important, especially when pronounced with a slight Middle Europe accent, like Dr. Kissinger used to do. Now the invasion of Russia in Ukraine shook us a little bit, and NATO woke up after the long sleep, but not before the bravura of expanding all over the place as if it ran the show. Reality check, NATO and the West do not run the show. We have to digest this, see clearly, and make a few decisions in that order, not make the decisions and then see clearly. After the collapse of communism, NATO seemed in a limbo. It failed to acknowledge its challengers and rivals plus the fact that Russia, China, and international Islam are way more slippery than the Soviet Union and its satellites ever were. For 4 decades, NATO was obsessed with the Red Scare. It was kind of morbid in the end because it blocked out any other concern. So trying to keep communism in check, it made lots of blunders. Plus the tactics, my enemy's enemy is my friend, spawned quite a few disasters. The Iraq campaign and the intervention in Libya being among the most spectacular. With all those fuzzy missions, it legitimized itself and legitimized the propaganda about how it was a machine that chowed down the taxpayers' money for decades, allowing the US to increase the military bases around the world and carry out slaughter, sometimes without even informing its allies. The left and the far right agreed on its obsolescence. For many people in Europe and in countries with strong anti-American feeling, NATO was always frowned upon. But at least during the Cold War, its purpose was clear, although its means were occasionally kind of maneuvers in the dark. But even the purpose was controversial. For anyone who thinks that the containment of communism was a desirable policy, there were not only failures, but also some successes. Conversely, for anyone who thinks that the US stood in the way of a communist paradise, American policy is perceived as totally malevolent. It's not a point to be dismissed easily, since the US have always resented any other rising power. But then again, it's not as simple as that. Truth be told, in recent years, US military bases here and there have meant nothing more than a handful of NATO soldiers bored to death, sometimes literally so. Hardly did the alleged Western interests have an immediate connection or proportion to military spending on the field. So the talk about NATO being wasteful and whether European countries should seek strategic autonomy, creating regional associations, was not totally unjustified. Donald Trump's presidency worsened the vibe. Promoting aggressively American slogan further divided the West being a concept he failed to grasp. And his rhetoric and brinkmanship highlighted some real disagreements amongst Western countries, together, of course, as always, with the narcissism of small differences. However, we all agree, more or less, that we live in a fragmented world with 4 poles, at least 4. The West, that is all those parts of the planet where there is democracy and the rule of law. Russia, China, and international Islam. All other players may fall in one of those categories or oscillate in a gray area or be really minor for now. If we identify our competitors, enemies, and frenemies, and it's imperative to do so making the distinctions, seeing the subtle nuances, that is, the unity of the West will emerge as our primordial goal. And NATO would be the Congress institution to represent it, especially after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We cannot afford internal bickering or inconsistent behavior like the one that forced France to withdraw from the military arm in '66, to return for the if I'm not, or Greece to NATO exercises for a good reason, has turned, as we all called, now we cannot afford new configurations. We must make do with what we already have, that is NATO. There are many hitches to this unity. The first is that we do not fully understand or agree upon the nature and dynamics of the world order today, on its four centers of power, yet on two politically and culturally opposite camps, liberal democracies and autocracies. The second hitch is that the America First policy, meaning, of course, America only or America on top of all, irritates us Europeans, together with the rest of the world, of course. The United States have not come up with one cool political idea since neglecting the security of our frontiers, denigrating electoral democracies, and distorting human rights in this flurry of political correctness. Yes, it will. Instead, we should be alert because there are, and there will be, lots of attempts to undermine Western unity from the outside. For instance, instrumentalizing energy supplies, but also from the inside, and not only from American hardliners who don't have a clue on world history and geopolitics. Not a clue, I'm telling you. Some people in high places think that Africa is a country. What must we do now? This is the year of living dangerously. Russian belligerence is very dangerous for world peace, but I'm afraid we've been too careless and too willing to use weaponry instead of diplomacy. So we sort of have awakened the beast. However, in this war in Ukraine, if this war in Ukraine doesn't kill us, it might make us stronger. It might galvanize Europeans who have become somewhat lazy and spoiled. And it may make them reconsider the dilemma, isolationism, interventionism, that is not exclusively American as we sometimes consider it. Those two stances must be attained. Some kind of balance between those two stances must be attained. If we agree that this division of the international community into democratic and an autocratic camp, not internally aligned for the time being, dominates and will dominate geopolitics for years to come, we can start making choices on which hotspots we can intervene, following an instinct, fight or flight, and on how to promote our economic and cultural interests without savior complexes or vigilante voluntarism that is quite an American feature quite often. For example, the last French troops left Mali last month after long wanderings in the desert. Although the end was inglorious, they did the right thing. They had to leave. Wherever we don't know what we're doing, we have to check out. I don't mean that the West should retreat itself. When it does, it leaves behind a vacuum that can be filled by our worst nightmare. Limited but well thought out and executed operations are necessary. Easier said than done, especially if we have in mind that NATO has not demonstrated strategic wisdom, and in some foreign lands, it alienated local populations and fanned the flames instead of doing the opposite. in order to be able to intervene effectively, when and where it is most required, and if it is required, we need to be self-sufficient inside our circle of allies. Avoid as much as possible rubbing shoulders with Russia or, say, Saudi Arabia or Qatar or Turkey, for that matter. And as I said, make a clear distinction between enemies, competitors, emulators, and so on. Russia these days is an enemy. China is not. China is dependent on our consumerism. So for the time being, it is a competitor with whom we are intertwined. It would be a huge mistake to make an enemy out of it. Donald Trump was reckless on this, and on a few other things, of course. Now, regarding Islamic theocracies, any pressure for human rights in their interior might have the reverse outcome, or no outcome at all. Attempts to export democracy to Islamic lands is mission impossible and way too expensive to boot. The Western idea that all people share the same values and desires is, I think, one of our dearest illusions. So studying better the recipients of future capitalism and democracy and winning hearts and minds might do the trick. Soft power, so to speak, smart power when needed, hard power together with rollback and the whole toolkit is outmoded. Russia is using it because it is regressing to Tsarism. That said, everywhere democracy was imposed at first, and it was accepted in the long run because individuals realized that they had to gain from it. And everywhere democracy has come under pressure. Fascism, Nazism, and Stalinism were quite European. Stalinism still lingers in the European left. Fascism inspires a few grassroots parties all over the West. Democracy is not inherent in the geography or the history of the West, although it is now the, by default, let's say, political system. In other words, we chose to have democracy imposed on us. Therefore, in some cases, it might be imposed on other countries. In some cases, in few cases. To do this in a context of peace and cooperation, there is a need of picking allies on an ideological and cultural basis, not on a financial one. For instance, the Asia-Pacific is a critical region for the future of the world order, and we should look out for friends. There are tensions between China and Taiwan, tensions between Western allies, Japan and South Korea with China, and also now with Russia, since Japan shares a border with Russia. These countries are getting more vocal about their opposition to Russia and China. Since the Ukraine conflict is impacting all these countries in this region, when it comes to the efforts of Western powers to promote democracy, there are a few subtle points we should take advantage of. China is not comfortable with the Russian attack on Ukraine, although, frankly, its heart belongs to this daddy, and vice versa. But China being now the giant, and Russia being the very wicked sidekick, perhaps we should be nicer to China for our own good. I mean, not too much Chinese rhetoric, and as I said, as many cultural exports as we can might pay off. I'm just saying. Nancy Pelosi's trip to Taiwan didn't sit too well with the Chinese, for a good reason, and who can blame them? She flew over there like a busybody. It was a mistake. The bottom line is, let's single out those who are dear to the Democratic camp and those who can be lured one way or another into the West. For example, by replacing weapon deliveries from Russia with weapons from us. India could be a good customer, and I think it is willing to be one. Always together with cultural exports. It's not rocket science. It's an alliance of democracies, and the world represents a lot of land and quite a few people. At the same time, there are a lot of countries that fall somewhere in the middle of that divide, with which the West does extensive business. They have dubious democratic records, Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, but they are fluid, so they might be won over. This is one of the challenges of the current phase of the Cold War, if that's how we name this mess. Russia, China, and the West are struggling to draw them in. It's also in our best interest to hamper, if we can, with autocratic unity. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have their differences, but they share anti-Westernism and they challenge the influence of the US and its allies and the world order. However, by not considering openly these two powers as one bloc, and by applying differentiating diplomacy, we might preserve a multipolarity which is more stable than bipolarity these days. At this point, I think bipolarity might lead to outright war. So we should always be on the lookout for peacemakers in the autocratic camp, and the autocratic camp should always be kept divided with non-belligerence as a yardstick. Some self-confidence is necessary on our part. But frankly, we should lose the condescending attitude that makes the West so obnoxious. As a strong economic force, a strong military force, and also as the best idea that appeals to billions of people all over the globe, we have a very vast bailiwick. We can change mindsets through the dissemination of democratic values, individual liberty, the right to determine your personal identity, and the like, as well as though an effective response to the propaganda about the West being doomed. Like during the previous Cold War, our biggest asset is that we have the best alternative to offer to people. Offer it, not rub it on their faces. Now, about the debate on the existence of the non-existence of the second Cold War. Many analysts don't utter the words for fear of speaking it into existence. But how can we define the tug of war between despotism and liberal democracy when nuclear threats are wafting overhead? It's a Cold War. If a Cold War is a protracted international rivalry in a framework of fragile peace, Cold Wars are as old as history itself, even if each time the setting is different. So I guess this is a very real Cold War we are experiencing, a multipolar one this time. Although President Biden has pledged that the United States were not seeking a new Cold War or a war divided into rigid blocs, fair enough, we agree, but it's a bit wishful thinking at the same time. The geopolitical reality is pretty grim, and there's so much acrimony that can sink any remnants of good faith, even in the face of common existential challenges. Avoiding painful turns of the past, as I said, burying our heads in the sand is what we do best, will not help us see what we did wrong, what opportunities we've missed in in the aftermath of the Cold War, how we contributed to the rapid regression of US-Russian relations after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and how we failed to steer our policies from the containment of communism to the containment of autocracies. To the containment of Russian imperialism, for example, Islamic infiltration, terrorism, and so on. Having underestimated economic equality, religious fervor, nationalism, and cultural conflicts that defined dissimilar regimes after the end of the First Cold War, the mystery is not why these threats exist today, but how we ever thought a different outcome was ever possible. I think that a less delusional worldview could offer a better chance for averting disaster. Invoking the Cold War should enable us to assay the globalized and interconnected context of today. Globalization cannot be thwarted or reversed. It's impossible. Some new challenges like global warming and cyber warfare have been added to the mix. But global poverty, inequality, far-right and far-left populism have existed throughout the 20th century and are going on strong in the 21st. Some commentators will still insist, that this second Cold War view is overblown and could plunge the United States and all of us in the West into gruesome proxy wars. Hello, I think this is a very brutal proxy war going on. Also, so I think that the argument is a bit passé after what happened in Ukraine. Also, some commentators underestimate the role of ideology today compared with its prominence during the First Cold War. I don't agree either. I think that the underestimation of ideology makes us morally and culturally equal to tyrants and zealots. There's a world apart between Western values and autocratic or theocratic dogmas. The issue today may not be Marxism versus liberalism, but it remains ideological just the same. Chinese goods have taken over the world, but Chinese cultural products are few. On the contrary, the West and the westernized countries produce and export cultural goods and lifestyles galore. We also export our worst habits, trends, manias, but there's little we can do about it for the time being. In conclusion, compromises are badly needed. When Russia is brandishing a nuclear threat and meaning it, there is no rhyme or reason to speak of. We, the West and Ukraine, must make concessions. Ukraine might be compelled to give away some territories to Russia, and then maybe we should all isolate Russia economically and diplomatically until it comes to its senses, if it ever does. The foreign policy of the West should probably boil down to a principle of non-intervention and a free trade when there is no other choice. Our concept may be let live and expose the largest possible populations to cultural products, to liberal universal values, provided we ourselves are faithful to those values. And when someone says, don't do that, or I'll raise hell, we'd better believe that raising hell is what they're gonna do. That was it. Are you there?
Yep. Thank you so much for your very candid and insightful keynote. We can now turn to some questions and answers. Is there any question that anybody would like to raise? Yes, Katarina.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the very thought-provoking talk. You mentioned Islamic theocracies, and in this context, I just wanted to ask a question about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which has been it has self-branded in a different way in the last few years with Vision 2030 and tried to purport a more liberal image. And also because of our love-hate relationship with Saudi Arabia over the years. So I just wanted to ask you what you think is the role of Saudi Arabia in this international arena as you've described it. Thank you.
Well, I think it's the typical frenemy. It's two-faced. They are very interested, of course, in selling oil, and they do their best. They have this youthful kind of personalities that they export to the rest of the world. And we are dependent on their oil for the time being, partly because we are moving away from this dependency. But we need time to do it. So, Emmanuel Macron met with Ben Salman. Kyriakos Mitsotakis met with Ben Salman. They couldn't afford not to for the time being. But we shouldn't have any illusions about what is happening in Saudi Arabia and about what will happen, because this kind of modernization is totally superficial for the time being. But that's exactly my point today, that we have to move away from all these states that are not prone to change, and we should find other sources of energy inside a circle of allies or rivals, but not frenemies as Pakistan or Saudi Arabia or even Turkey, although Turkey is unfortunately a member of NATO. So meeting Salman and shaking his hand is kind of ugly, but there is little we can do at this moment, because we need the oil. And as I said, Europeans are so spoiled that they cannot admit any compromise regarding their living standards. We can't afford to be a bit cold during the winter, or pay more for oil, for energy, for traditional forms of energy. So for the time being, since we've made the mistake decades ago, we cannot cut off ties with all these countries. I'm afraid we are in a trap, and the whole problem will be solved by a new policy on energy and on imports from Arab countries, from all those Islamic theocracies. But at the same time, when we intervene in their interior affairs, I don't think it's productive in any way. Have I answered, or?
Yes.
I mean, there is not a solution to every problem today, because there is some inertia from the past. And we have to make do, as I said, with what we have today, and try to break away from all those morbid international relations that we have. And we have a lot of them.
Thank you, thank you. Julian House, another question.
Is there anybody in the room? I can't see anything.
Well, there are many.
Really?
Yes, they're all listening attentively.
Really?
Yes.
I can't see anybody. I see some red backdrop.
The seats are red. Anyway, I would like to ask a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your excellent and moderate speech. And I'm referring to your suggestion, which I think is a very good one, of steering towards a compromise in the current Ukraine-Russia war. Do you think this is realistic? When I look at the news and when I look what the Americans keep saying, and all the European governments, of course, following this line, as they always do, they now say that the referenda are fake and we shouldn't do this, etc. Do you think this a suggestion that there might be a compromise? Personally, I would love to see that, but I have a very negative assessment of this.
Well, heroism is a bit old-fashioned. We should be more realistic, and also our priority should be peace. Because even if Ukraine and the West and its allies and the West defeat Russia, and Russia is mortified, is humiliated, will pay this humiliation real badly. Remember what happened with Germany being humiliated, well, in 1919. We shouldn't wish a clear outcome in this war. We should wish a compromise that would, in a way, satisfy and not satisfy both parties. But if we advise the Ukrainians, and that's what we're doing, I think, to go on with the war and kind of defeat the big bear, the big Russian bear, we are in a lot of trouble, because Russia will take a revenge one way or another. And I am sure it will be another, which is the worst revenge it can in the future, in the near future. So if they give away a little land, not all of it, not satisfy all Russian requirements and demands, but some of them, I think we should be more stable for some time. And of course, I hope I'm not sounding like Noam Chomsky, but he has a point on this. NATO should not play in that sandbox. It's very dangerous. We may think every country has a right to choose its camp, its alliances. Well, it's a bit idealistic. It's another sandbox around Russia, in the Orient. And we should respect those abstract borders. For Sweden or Finland to become members of NATO, it's kind of natural. But for Ukraine or Georgia, we should think twice. It's not very heroic what I'm saying, but it's on the safe side.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Zohar? Yep.
Yes, thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I wonder, following up Juliana's question, I wonder if your question stands for policy of appeasement, and we know what the consequences of appeasement were before World War II.
Well, appeasement didn't work too well. But for 40 years, for more than 40 years, we had peace and development. In a way, I'm a bit nostalgic about the Cold War, the first Cold War, because although threats were uttered also at that time, twice to three times, war was averted. There was no real conflict, except by the proxy war in Afghanistan in the end. But I think that even if it doesn't work the way we want it to work, peace is the foremost value, and we have to preserve it, although it may seem bitter compromise. I don't think that going to war at this time and causing so much disaster in Ukraine and also in Russia will help the world order in any way. I think that this choice is wrong, and that we in the West should have convinced Ukraine not to go to war, even if now it seems that it has some victories on the field. It will not be victorious in the long run. It's a small country, and Russia is big and very aggressive. And Putin's last discourse, speech, showed that he's like a very angry animal, a beast, as I said, that has awakened and will not stop before total disaster. And he's not bluffing about the nuclear threat. He can do it. Not on a world scale, but he can do it. Because he's not rational. There is no rationality playing here at all. That's why I refer to realpolitik, because realpolitik tends to explain everything through logic. And there is no logic. There is feeling. There is anger. Excuse me? Hello?
Yep, we'll have you back. Okay. Thank you very much. Any further questions? Okay. Oh, sorry, Professor Lequien. No. To the back, Professor Lequien.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Christian Lequien. I'm a professor at Sciences Po in Paris. I'm sorry I came late, but since I'm here, I'm very shocked. I have to tell you about what you're saying, because all your discourse is built around the fact that balance of power is more important than the sovereign rights of people to decide about themselves. And the question of Ukraine and Russia is not just a question of big and small. It's a question about what the Ukrainians want about their own future. So it's a bit cynical, I guess, to have an approach like yours, which just said, well, we don't have to humiliate the Russians, blah, 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 because the Russians, are powerful. Of course it's true, but it's not the issue. The issue is, what do the Ukrainians want for themselves? The issue is, where do the Ukrainians want to go in the future, right? And clearly, a majority of Ukrainians don't want to continue a close relationship with Russia. And this is their right. So I have to say I completely disagree with your statement and your presentation.
I didn't mean that Ukraine should be a Russian satellite, a Russian sidekick. My disagreement with what is going on today is the NATO membership, not the belonging to a democratic system or camp. Let me be clear about that. It's about being a NATO member. That was the point of friction more than choices of regime or alliances or any other relationship with the West. Do we agree on that? Are you there?
Yes, but I don't think the problem is NATO membership. The problem is that Russia is not accepting that Ukraine is a sovereign state, and that's the issue. That's the issue.
Okay, about that. But what I'm saying is that a few compromises on the field, not a compromise on a political level, but on a territorial level, would promote peace, and we would be all in a position to talk. This is not the way to promote Ukrainian rights or world peace. It's not cynical. It's, I think, the opposite of cynical. Cynicism is the road to war and disaster. It's a long discussion.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Teemu Häkkinen. I'm from University of Jyväskylä, Finland. My country just submitted an application to become a member in NATO in the spring this year, only because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I was just thinking that how can you talk if you cannot trust what the guy who you're talking with, if you cannot trust what he is saying, she is saying, as is the case with the Russian administration at the moment. How can you negotiate if there's no trust of the outcome? Thank you.
Well, that's what I was saying, that we haven't built trust through the years. And now we're paying the price. I insist that we have some, not all the responsibility, but we have some responsibility about the way Russia has been conducting itself in the world, and that we have shown some kind of maybe this is a cliche, but it's true, some kind of arrogance, because our goal was always a unipolar world, and Russia, and of course China, will never accept that. So I think that this is a mess that we have contributed to. That's my point. It's not that it's not a blame game. It's let's say an evaluation of what has happened these 30 years, and we cannot really divide the world to the goodies and the baddies like we always tend to do. Of course, we have, as I said, and repeated many times, the best idea for politics, for lifestyles, but not all people agree. So we have to sit at a table of negotiations, diplomacy, and try to work it out. Even if we don't trust each other, of course we don't trust each other. Who can trust Putin? But it is what it is. My whole point is that we have to steer from weaponry to diplomacy. We have to talk about all these matters. And I think that Joe Biden kind of presented this idea, although this time in his speech last week was more vocal than he ever was against Russia. But this is, I don't think that this is the way to achieve Ukrainian independence from Russia and development for it, and for all the countries that are interested in developing in the Western way, like Georgia, for example.
Thank you very much. There's another question I see. Yeah, we'll just take another one from Professor Lecomte.
Just maybe thank you for your presentation, but maybe just one point I think in this debate is that when we look at the war in Ukraine today, we should remember that there's been already an invasion of Crimea in 2014, and at that time we tried to have the compromise. We didn't really intervene. We did like very limited sanctions. In that sense, that kind of policy failed. And I think we are in a situation where sovereignty is a key element, I think, for the not only for Western values but also for the world orders, because territorial disputes are not only between Ukraine and Russia, but we see that also now with Armenia and Uzbekistan, in other part of let's say the former Soviet Union, but also in a lot of other countries all over the world. So if we go that way, I think we are introducing precedents that will create further tensions in other countries. So, and even in Europe, I think there are a lot of territorial dispute, and being ready to compromise for the principle of sovereignty would trigger more tensions, more wars. So I don't think that would be the right.
That might be the case, but we don't know. We don't know if it's going to develop like that. Maybe it develops the other way, the opposite way. We have leverage. We have financial leverage. Because we're customers of Russia and of other countries that have dubious regimes, and we have this leverage. We can negotiate about, borders, territories, and all those exports that they're doing. They are dependent on us. So we have something in our hands to negotiate. We're not like, disarmed. But I think that we should use all these peaceful tools, financial tools, diplomatic tools, that is, in order to avoid war.
Maybe
it's very easy to be so heroic if we're not on the field. But who asks Ukrainians how they feel about that, about the destruction of their country, even if, as I said, they have some victories? Yeah. They're paying the price. We are not. Yeah. But we are talking about big ideas.
Yeah. But I would say that this is not just a Western issue. I would say that China and even India could also put pressure on Russia to find a solution. And I think that's what they are trying to do. But I think we need also to have that kind of discussion also with the Chinese and Indian.
Absolutely, yeah. I said that too. Yeah, of course. Of course, China can pressure Russia, but we have to pressure China to pressure Russia.
Thank you very much. Again, thank you for taking the time early in the morning to be with us, and thanks everybody for listening in and contributing. So we break for a coffee break, and we come back at 10:30, 10:40, about 30 minutes from now. Thank you very much.
See you later.
Sorry, Temis.